Hey everyone, how are you doing? Let's continue the series of reviewing some chess games that I played recently. This was a game against a player ranked 1263, and even though I did not start too well, I managed to win the game. Let's jump right in and review that game. I opened with the king's pawn opening, moving the pawn up to e4. My opponent responded with the queen's pawn opening by bringing the pawn to d5, offering the exchange. I decided not to take the pawn and instead moved my knight to c3. My opponent continued the attack by moving the pawn to d4. At this point, I moved my knight back to ce2, and this is when my opponent strengthened his pawn structure by moving the pawn to e5. Trying to break this pawn structure, I moved my pawn up to c3. Instead of taking the pawn, my opponent moved the queen to h4, attacking the king. Since I no longer had the c2 pawn supporting the d3 pawn, I moved my pawn to d3, trying to prevent this pawn on d4 from advancing further. At this point, my opponent played his knight to c6, and at this point I chose to take the pawn on d4, and my opponent chose to take the pawn on d4 with the e pawn. I moved my knight to f3, trying to attack this queen and have it go away. My opponent moved the queen back. If you notice in this opening, I am allowing my opponent to bring the bishop to the square b4. So ideally, before even moving my knight to f3, I should have moved the pawn to a3 to prevent the bishop or the knight from ever moving to the square b4. So I think that was a mistake on my part, and I continue the mistake by bringing my bishop to g5, trying to attack the queen. My opponent correctly brings the bishop to b4 and gives me a check. And here is where I make a very big mistake, and you can see from the evaluation bar that it's a really big mistake. What I should have done is bring my bishop back to d2. That way my bishop is no longer under attack by the queen. Secondly, I am also attacking the opponent's bishop, but by bringing my knight to c3, I am allowing it to be captured by the pawn. Strangely, my opponent does not take the offered knight and instead moves the queen to this square. Strangely, I do not play this move bishop back to d2. My opponent missed taking the free piece. As you can see, the opponent could have taken the pawn, taken my knight and gone on to queen his pawn, but the opponent did not do so. Anyway, let's move on. I make a further mistake by not attacking his bishop. Had I attacked his bishop would have gone back and I could have attacked the bishop with the pawn move to b4, thereby taking the bishop in case the opponent captured my knight. But instead I did not do that and I moved my queen to c1. This allowed my opponent to win my knight. I took with the pawn, and at this point my opponent, as you can see, is clearly better. There is no attack on any of the opponent's pieces. In any case, I bring my rook to the open file, the b file. The opponent moves the knight to f6. Now here I try to attack the bishop on a5 while simultaneously protecting my own bishop on g5. Here is where my opponent makes a slight mistake by castling on the king side, and the reason this is a mistake is that it allows me to kick the opponent's queen by moving my knight to h4. So at this point my opponent makes a further mistake by threatening my rook on b5. Now my idea behind moving my bishop to the square e2 is so that I can attack the queen by moving my knight to e5. But the only problem with this is that his knight is there to take my knight in case I do so. And I also realize that my opponent's queen is trapped because he can not move to the square h6. He cannot also move to h5. So in an effort to weaken this knight, I play a good move. I choose to take the bishop. And here my opponent makes a further mistake by choosing to take with the knight, and this allows me to put more pressure and win the queen. My opponent has no escape squares for the queen, so is forced to take the queen, forced to take my bishop on g5, at which point I take the queen. Now as you can see, the balance of the game has shifted drastically. Now I have no problems exchanging my pieces because I am clearly in a better position. I take his knight, he takes back with a pawn, and at this point I castle to complete my development of all my pieces. The opponent attacks my pawn on a2. I move it ahead to a3. My opponent moves his rook to the b file. Wanting to prevent any attacks on this diagonal, I move my pawn up to c4. My opponent seems relentless in attacking this pawn on the a file, so I move it further up, and my opponent doesn't let up, so I move it finally to a5, given that it's protected by my queen. My opponent moves his other rook to the d file, trying to pressure my pawn on d3. At this point I play a good move. I move my pawn up to e5, pressuring the knight. At the same time, if the knight moves away, I win the rook and give checkmate. So my opponent has no option but to threaten my queen. I move back. The opponent moves the pawn to g5, and I take the pawn on h6. At this point my opponent moves the knight back to h6 to h7, sorry, and this time I want to bring my rook on the f rank into the game, so I move the pawn up to f4. My opponent chooses to take the pawn on a5 with the rook. I take the pawn on g5. My opponent takes another pawn on e5 with the rook, and at this point I attack the pawn on f7 by moving my pawn ahead of the g5. This seems to be a questionable move by my opponent because it allows me to capture his pawn and give a check. My opponent captures with the bishop, and at this point I miss a very easy move. Given that my bishop is under attack by his rook, I should have moved my queen to the square f6, thereby threatening both his rooks in one move, and on the next move I could have captured one of those rooks. Instead, I move my queen back to d2, and this allows my opponent to play a good move. My opponent takes this pawn on c4, knowing that I cannot capture the bishop with the d3 pawn, because then I'll lose my queen. I decide to exchange my rook for his knight. Check. I give a check with my queen. I give another follow-up check, waiting for the king to move to a white square so that I can take his bishop, and my opponent chooses not to take my bishop, so I give a follow-up check with my bishop. One more check on the d file, and with this I get to give a check to the king and win a rook. I threaten to play checkmate. My opponent gives a follow-up check, and at this point it's just a matter of finding some moves and finishing the formalities. I get to win the pawn on c7. Check. I move away, and at this point it's very difficult for my opponent to capture any of my pieces. And after this check, I move my king behind my opponent's king, thereby preventing any future checks. I take the pawn on c6, thereby giving a check to my opponent's king, at the same time protecting my pawn on g2. My opponent moves the king away and I give a check. I continue pushing my pawn forward. One more check. And my opponent cannot give any other checks at this point. So I continue pushing my pawn forward. My opponent has no option but to exchange his rook for my pawn. And after a couple of moves, my opponent resigns. So as you can see, I made a few very important or big blunders in the opening, but I realized at some point that his queen was getting trapped, and I tried to play some moves and tempt my opponent into taking my rook so that I could trap and win my opponent's queen. So good game, though I could have done much better in the opening. If you're watching this review and enjoyed it, do let me know what you could have done differently at different stages in this game. As always, thank you for watching.